Welcome to my first venture into DVD video. I wanted to use the DVD format so I could present the material to you at its best available quality. There are some real advantages to the DVD format apart from the superior video and audio aspects. I've quite often made alternative audio mixes that run alongside the exercises so that you can hear mixes of just the drums with a click or the drums in a musical setting without the click, and hopefully that way you can hear both sides of an illusion. You can switch between the two mixes by pressing the audio button on your DVD remote handset whenever you see this sign. I've also included some foreign language subtitle tracks which again you can select from your DVD remote handset. Most of the topics covered in this first disc are based on the Rhythmic Illusions book, and I've picked out some of the most important parts so that I could give you a more in-depth, up-close look at the concepts and hopefully a clearer explanation of my ideas. I hope you enjoy it. The first use of displacement is about taking a pattern and shifting it to a new position in the bar, either forwards or backwards by a certain amount of subdivisions, so that the downbeat in the pattern, the first bass drum, isn't necessarily on the one of the bar. It plays around with people's perception of downbeat and backbeat, and it's because of this that rhythmic illusions are possible. Now when you hear a rhythm that's got a bass drum, snare drum, bass drum, snare drum, you naturally organise those notes in your brain to be 1, 2, 3, 4, even if that's not really where they are. So displacement can be an interesting tool for you to manipulate the rhythm and create tension in the music. Okay, I'd like to start off by showing you a very simple example of displacement. I'm going to play a straight pattern for 4 bars, and at the end of 4 bars I'm going to take that exact pattern and displace it forwards by 1/8 note. Then I'm going to do that for 4 bars, then I'm going to return to the original groove in its original place. And it sounds like this. Okay, now I'm going to do a very similar thing. I'm going to play a straight pattern for 4 bars, then I'm going to take that pattern and displace it forward by 1/16. Then after I've done that for 4 bars, I'm going to go back to the original groove in its original place again. Okay, this time when I get to the displacement part, I'm going to move the whole pattern forwards by 3/16. Okay, this time I'm going to take the pattern and displace it backwards by 3/16. Okay, now we're going to move into 12/8. Again, I'm going to play 4 bars of a straight groove, then I'm going to displace that 12/8 pattern forwards by 1/8 note. Then after I've done that for 4 bars, I'm going to go back to the original groove in its original position. It'll sound like this. Okay, I'm going to do the 12/8 pattern again, but this time when I get to the displacement part, I'm going to displace the pattern forwards by a 24th note. It should sound like this. So the second use of displacement is to think of it as a kind of variation generator, and this works especially well if you apply it to slightly irregular rhythms. So let me give you an example of a slightly irregular rhythm in 4/4. So when you apply displacement to a pattern like this, it doesn't really come across to the listener as an illusion, such as the examples we did in the previous chapter, displacement 1. Because this rhythm doesn't have regularly spaced backbeats on 2 and 4, when it's displaced, it's a little too odd for the listener to recognise any familiar shape to it. So what I'm going to do now is play that pattern for 4 bars, then I'm going to displace it forwards by 1/16th, and after 4 bars of that, I'm going to pull it back into its original position. So I like to think of this type of displacement as a simple way of generating new patterns, because when I displace a pattern like this, I start to hear it as a completely new pattern. Now I'm going to play it again, and after 4 bars I'm going to displace it backwards by 1/16th, and then 4 bars later I'll return it to its original position. Okay, this time when I come to the displacement part, I'm going to take the pattern and move it backwards 1/8 note, then return to the groove in its original position. Okay, this time the displacement section is the pattern moved backwards 3/16ths. Okay, this time I'll displace the pattern forwards 1/4 note. Okay, finally, I'm going to take the pattern and displace it forwards by 5/16. Subdivisions are the notes you play in between the pulses. They're the fundamental building blocks of almost everything you'll ever play, so I can't stress enough how important these following exercises are. In fact, I think every musician should practice these following exercises. Your ability to accurately play subdivisions will ultimately determine how good you are at keeping time. So I strongly recommend that you get yourself a click, set it to around 40 beats per minute, and play through these exercises, focusing on accuracy so there's no flams between you and the click. I'm going to start off on the first step by actually not playing a subdivision. I'm just going to play exactly with the pulse, like this. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 2. So I'm going to play 2 notes on the hi-hat to every click. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 3, which is also known as triplets. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 4, which is also known as sixteenths. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 5, which is also known as quintuplets. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 7. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 8. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 9. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 10. 1, 2, 3, 4. Next, I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 11. 1, 2, 3, 4. Lastly, I'm going to subdivide the pulse into 12. 1, 2, 3, 4. I'd like to give you a clear explanation of what I mean by spacings. When I refer to spacing, I'm talking about the amount of subdivision that has passed between the bass drum acting as a downbeat and the snare drum acting as a backbeat. So let me play you an example now of a spacing of 3. One, two, three, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. So there you could clearly hear 3 subdivisions between the bass drum and the snare drum. Now if I choose to change the hi-hat part or play some ghost notes on the snare drum or maybe add some extra bass drum notes, it still remains a spacing of 3. So now I'm going to play an example like that, and in the middle of the example I'm going to slow right down so that we can easily count the subdivisions. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1. So you can still hear 3 subdivisions passing between the main bass drum as a downbeat and the main snare drum acting as a backbeat. Although there's lots of other notes involved, you still get a feeling of a downbeat and a backbeat. Now I'm going to play you an example of a spacing of 4. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, 1. Okay, there you can hear 4 subdivisions passing between the main bass drum downbeat and the main snare drum backbeat. Okay, now I'm going to play a spacing of 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 1. Now I'm going to give you an example of a spacing of 6. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 1. Now here's an example of a spacing of 7. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 1. Now here's an example of a spacing of 8. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 1. Okay, now finally, here's an example of a spacing of 9. Again, I'll slow it right down so that we can count all the subdivisions. 1, 2, 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 9 1. Modulation is another kind of tool that you can use to create a rhythmic illusion. Whereas with displacement we were looking at the illusion of creating a new downbeat, with modulation you can create the illusion of a new tempo, and you do this by grouping the subdivision with spacing. Now in this first chapter we're going to look at modulation type 1, and I call it type 1 because it uses regular subdivisions, things like triplets, eighth notes, sixteenths, and it also features regular spacings like spacings of 3, 4, 6 and 8. Now when you choose a spacing that doesn't match the subdivision, like if I choose a spacing of 4 and I've got a subdivision of triplets, from the listener's point of view, a new illusionary tempo should emerge because of the regularity of the bass drum to snare drum relationship. Okay, I'd like to start off with a very simple example of a modulation type 1. In 12/8, I'll play a few bars of 12/8 first, then I'll make the modulation. Hopefully you'll hear the new illusionary tempo emerging. Then I'll go back to the straight 12/8 pattern, and it sounds like this. Okay, now I'm going to make another modulation for you. This time I'm going to choose a spacing of 4. So there'll be 4 subdivisions between the main bass drum and snare drum hits. Okay, this next one is a very similar modulation. It has the same spacing between the bass drum and snare drum. This time I'm going to break up the hi-hat line and I'm going to add a few more bass drum beats. Okay, now I'm going to change the hi-hat pattern and syncopate the bass drum a little bit more. Okay, now I'm going to go into 4/4 and choose sixteenths as my basic subdivision. Again, I'll play some straight time in 4/4, then I'll make the modulation, then I'll go back to playing straight time in 4/4 again so you can feel the switch. In this first example, I'm going to choose a spacing of 3. So there'll be a bass drum, 3/16 later there'll be a snare drum, 3/16 later there'll be another bass drum, 3/16 later there'll be another snare drum. And again, with that regularity, you should feel this new illusionary tempo coming through. Okay, this next modulation features a spacing of 6. So now there'll be 6 subdivisions between the main bass drum and main snare drum hits. Now here's another spacing of 6, and this one features a very famous half-time shuffle groove. This next modulation features a spacing of 9, which is made up of 3 groups of 3, and when it's in that format, I still consider it to be a common spacing. I define modulation type 2 as having common subdivisions, things like triplets, eighth notes, sixteenths, that kind of thing, together with uncommon spacings such as 5s and 7s. Now in this first example, I'm going to choose a subdivision of sixteenths in 4/4. I'm going to play 4 bars of groove first, then I'm going to make the modulation, which will be a spacing of 5. So 5 subdivisions between the bass drum downbeat and the snare drum backbeat. Then I'll return to the groove. So as you can see, modulation type 2 can create some pretty intense rhythmic effects. Now I'm going to play a more syncopated pattern of 5 in the modulation, and this time the spacing of 5 is basically all in the bass drum. So every 5th subdivision there will be a bass drum note. In this next example, when I get to the modulation part, I'm going to use a spacing of 7. So there'll be 7 subdivisions between the bass drum downbeat and the snare drum backbeat. In this next example, I'm going to play a more syncopated pattern, and this time the spacing of 7 is all in the bass drum. So every 7th subdivision there'll be a bass drum note. Okay, now I'm going to change the basic subdivisions to triplets. And in this next example, I'm going to start off by playing a shuffle groove, then I'll make a modulation, which will be a spacing of 5, then I'll go back to the groove again. Okay, now I'm basically going to do the same thing again, but this time I'm going to use a spacing of 7. The trick of playing a modulation is to always keep your head in the original time base. So in this case we're in 4/4. It's important for me to know where the downbeats are whilst I'm doing a modulation playing a pattern of 5 or 7 or whatever, because at some point I'm going to have to break off the pattern, play a little resolving fill and hit a downbeat to go back into the 4/4 groove again. The definition that I give to modulation 3 is that it uses uncommon subdivisions, such as quintuplets and septuplets. Now, in this first example, I'm going to play a groove in 4/4, then I'm going to make the modulation, then I'm going to play a groove in 4/4 again. When I get to the modulation of this first example, I'm going to choose quintuplets as my subdivision. So to every quarter note pulse, in my mind, I'm making 5 even little subdivisions to every pulse, and then with those subdivisions I'm going to space them into groups of 3. So there'll be a bass drum followed by a snare drum, followed by a bass drum, followed by a snare drum, followed by a bass drum, and so on like that. And the regularity of the bass drum to snare drum relationship should make you feel like I've gone into a new tempo, but the reality is I haven't changed tempo in my mind, I've only changed the subdivision. So it sounds like this. This next example is quite similar. When I get to the modulation part, I'm going to use the quintuplet subdivisions again, but this time I'm going to change the spacing between the bass drum and the snare drum to a spacing of 4. Okay, now I'm going to make another quintuplet modulation, but this time I'm going to jazz up the hi-hat part a bit and add a few more bass drum notes. In this next example, I'm going to choose septuplets as the subdivisions for the modulation. So when I get there, I'm going to be singing 7 subdivisions to every quarter note pulse. And then with those 7 subdivisions, I'm going to choose a spacing of 4 between the bass drum and the snare drum, like this. In this next example, I'm going to be using the septuplets again as the subdivisions for the modulation. Only this time I'm going to choose a spacing of 6 between the bass drum and snare drum. I hope you've had a chance to check out the subdivisions and spacings chapters on this disc, because now we're going to combine the two into what I would call a master modulation exercise. It's important to understand the differences between spacings and subdivisions. For instance, if I play a spacing of 3 like this, it doesn't necessarily mean that the subdivisions are triplets as well. In most cases of popular music, the subdivisions match the spacings, and this throws up some interesting light on people's assumptions about rhythm. If you've grown up on a diet of Western popular music, there's 3 basic assumptions that you'll make when you're presented with a rhythm. For example, the first assumption is that the first note I played on the bass drum is the 1, the downbeat. The second is you'll have a feel of the tempo by the regularity of the bass drum to snare drum relationship, 1, 2, 3, 4. And thirdly, you'll have a feel of the subdivisions, the notes that I'm playing on the hi-hat. So probably you're going to assume that this is in 4/4, it's got a 16s feel, and it's this kind of tempo, 1, 2, 3, 4. It's because of these assumptions that rhythmic illusions are possible, and knowing that the listener is having these assumptions means that I can play around with the parameters and come up with some interesting rhythmic effects. I'd like to explain the concept of these following exercises to you. Now basically we're going to take a subdivision such as triplets and then run through all the spacing types, from a spacing of 3 to a spacing of 4 to a spacing of 5, right up to a spacing of 9, but always at the same tempo and always with the subdivision of triplets. Now in this first exercise, because the spacing matches the subdivision, It's not going to sound that strange or polyrhythmic, but it's just the first step of the ladder. Okay, now without changing the tempo or the triplet subdivision, I'm going to play a spacing of 4. This presents the listener with a kind of polyrhythmic tempo dilemma, because they can hear the tempo that I'm counting in at, but when I start to play the spacing of 4, they'll probably pick up on the slower illusionary tempo that's created by the spacing of 4, like this. Now, staying with the same concept, I'm going to switch up to playing a spacing of 5. Okay, now I'm going to play a spacing of 6, and you'll notice that because the spacing of 6 is related to the triplet subdivision, it's just going to feel like a half-time groove. Now I'm going to play a spacing of 7. Now I'm going to play a spacing of 8. You'll probably have noticed that the illusionary tempos that are created internally by the spacings are getting slower and slower as the spacings are getting further and further apart. So I'm going to finish off by playing a spacing of 9. Okay, now we're basically going to do exactly the same thing again, except this time I'm going to change the subdivisions up to 16ths. Then I'm going to go back to the start of the spacings list and start with a spacing of 3. And this time, without stopping, once the spacing of 3 has resolved with the click, I'm going to hit the splash cymbal and move up to the spacing of 4. And then once that has resolved with the click, I'll hit the splash cymbal again and move up to the spacings of 5. And then up to 6, 7, 8, and finally a spacing of 9. I'm sure by now you've got the hang of this concept. So this time I'm going to change the subdivisions up to 5s, quintuplets, and then run through the entire spacings list again. Due to the space allocation on this disc, I'm going to choose to do one more master exercise. I'm going to choose the subdivision of sevens, or septuplets, and again play through the spacings list from 3 to 9. I hope you get a chance to play this spacing list with all the subdivisions. It's really a worthwhile exercise. Okay, I'd like to demonstrate a piece for you now where I put some displacement into action, and you can hear me turning the beat round quite a few times. I like to utilise this technique with the left hand playing the hi-hat under the right hand. The first time that I heard what I thought was a rhythmic illusion was in the mid-1970s. I would have been about 12 or 13 years old at the time. It was on a Patrick Williams album called Come On and Shine, and there was one track on there that really grabbed my rhythmical interest. And what I liked about it was that the drummer, Steve Schaefer, played fills that went over the bar line and landed on the second eighth note of the next bar. And it appeared that with some of the fills, he was trying to disguise the beat in some way. I would probably now call it displacing. Anyway, here's a rough version of what I remember about that track. So after I'd finished listening to that Patrick Williams track a few thousand times, it got me thinking about how I could capture the excitement and tension of what the drummer was doing on this track. Rather than just learning a few of his fills and playing them forevermore, I wanted to understand the concept behind it so I could use it for my own playing and in my own style. So I'll play a piece for you now where I can demonstrate what I thought was the essence of this idea, to create a little illusion just before an obvious accent. So I'll play a few bars of groove leading up to an eighth note push, which is in the middle of bar 4. And every time the cycle repeats, I'll play a different fill. Of course, if this was a real musical situation, I wouldn't play fills like that every 4 bars. But if you use it sparingly, it can have a strong emotional impact and get the listeners on the edge of their seats. Every now and then, a situation will arise where you can put some of these rhythmic illusion ideas into practice. A few years back, I played in a British funk band called Incognito, and we recorded a song called Always There. Now, the way we originally played this piece was that all the bridge sections were in half time, and I suggested that I could create a rhythmic illusion of the tempo and make a kind of modulated triplet waltz feel just for the second bridge. So the illusion is based on 16s grouped into threes. So first I picked out every third 16th note, like this. 2, 3, 4. And then I put that onto the ride cymbal. Then I made a spacing of 3 between the bass drum and snare drum. So every third ride cymbal beat there would be a bass drum or a snare drum. Then at the end of that section I played a little fill and we went back into the original tempo. Only the tempo didn't actually change for me because I had a quarter note click running throughout the entire piece, and if you check out the alternative audio track you'll hear the click that I was playing to. So I just made it a kind of rhythmic illusion, but the rest of the band saw it as a tempo change and just played along to it. Anyway, it sounds like this. Okay, now I'd like to show you an exercise which is a sort of rhythmic journey. It starts off in 12/8 with a shuffled bass drum ostinato like this. Now I'm going to make a modulation by accenting every fourth subdivision on the hi-hat, and this should make us feel like we've gone into 3/4. Now I'm going to make an obvious pattern in 4/4 by using the sticking of a samba. And then the sticking of a rumba clave. Now I'm going to put the whole exercise together, starting off in 12/8, then modulating the hi-hat into 3/4, then playing the sticking of the samba and the rumba clave, which are obviously in 4/4. And it sounds like this. Now what I really like about this exercise is the syncopation that happens between the hi-hat accents and the bass drum ostinato. I know the patterns on their own aren't incredibly exciting, but when you put the two together, it's like this third element appears on top, which is basically the sum of the two parts, and I would call this third element harmonic syncopation. Now I'm going to take this exercise one step further and introduce a double bass drum ostinato. It's still basically the same exercise, the bass drums are still cycling in groups of 3, and again I'll play the rumba and samba hi-hat accents. Then it got me thinking about how I could develop this idea by using the methods of rhythmic illusions. In this next example, I'm going to start off by playing a rhythm in 5/8. Then I'm going to introduce 3 other patterns on top of it. And notice how the harmonic syncopations build up between the opposing rhythms. Now I'm going to make another 4-way rhythm, again using the laws of rhythmic illusions. And finally, here's another set of opposing rhythms. It's interesting to go back over these last 3 films and take time to focus on just one individual part. For instance, in the first film, I started off by playing a groove in 5/8. So just lock yourself into that 5/8 pattern and follow it all the way through the film, and just experience the other 3 rhythms as they come on top of that from that 5/8 perspective. And then perhaps go back, and when the brush part begins, just follow the brush part all the way through and experience the other 3 rhythms from that perspective.